everyone, welcome back to Musings for Monday. My name is Elizabeth Manikin from the Ackland Art Museum. I'm joined by my colleague and co-host Allison Portnow-Lathrop, and today we have three guests, all from the Ackland staff, here to muse with us. For those of you new to our program, Musings is a deck of cards that contains quotes, questions, and prompts from philosophers, art historians, museum educators, the gamut. And all of them are really meant to provoke conversations, thoughts about the nature of art, the nature of museums, how they relate to us as individuals, and how they inform the way that we see the world around us. So we have a great crew assembled today. And Allison, you want to introduce our guests?
Yeah, thanks, Elizabeth. So today we are very pleased to be joined by three of our coworkers from all across the museum. We have Dana Cowan here, who is the Sheldon Peck Curator for European and American Art before 1950. We have Amatullah King, who's the Executive Assistant in the Administrative Department at the Ackland, and Dylan Welch, our Events Coordinator. So welcome, everyone. It's good to have you here. I have the honor of reading our question for the day, which will get all of us started thinking, but we encourage you at home to start thinking about this too. We have a quote here and then a question to get us started thinking. All right. The art historian Carol Duncan writes that we think of churches and temples as religious sites different in kind from secular sites such as museums, courthouses, or state capitals. We associate different kinds of truth with each kind of site. So, what kinds of truths do you associate with museums, and what makes them seem true? How are they different from those realized in religious, spiritual, political, and various everyday contexts? So, let's see. Dana, would you like to start us off speaking about this?
Yeah, sure. This is a really interesting question, and one that I've spent a lot of time thinking about, not just now, but in general. When we think about truth, and I had to actually think about what is truth, and how do we know that something is true? And so, of course, I went to my trusty thesaurus, and I was like, okay, what can we look at here? And, there are things that came up like veracity, sincerity, honesty, genuineness, accuracy. And so that made me start thinking about museums and the role of museums. And the first truth that came into my mind was the historical truth. So we have objects dating from, the ancient world all the way to the present. And so it is a place for us to explore historical truths. And that's on a macro level. It's also a place of understanding the truths of the human condition and of human understanding. And I think that is one of the hallmarks of museums. Also of just the truth of creativity and of beauty. I think that's really important. That's on a macro level. But when you think about the museum on a micro level in terms of the objects themselves. So what is truth? Well, the objects in the museum are works that imitate nature in a lot of ways. So are they true? And how do we determine whether they are, if something is from the 13th century or the 14th century, and how do we kind of make those metrics? And so then I went into this whole rabbit hole. But, it's really interesting to think about veracity and truth in terms of artwork. And then we have another level of the museum itself. We're seen as kind of authorities on art history, but is that necessarily the truth? And so there's lots of ways to unpack this question, and I'll let other people kind of chime in, because I would love to hear how other people kind of approached this question.
I approach truth as fact. I agree, Dana. I sort of thought about all the ways that you can think about truth, and I just said I have to focus on this one because there's too many variables here. So I sort of thought about it as thinking of basically swapping out the word truth for fact. And overall, people really see museums, as you said, an authority, as fact, and not just art museums. You know, a better example might be something like a science museum or a history museum. And I think it's generally accepted that those truths are for everyone. Whereas if you're going to look at politics or church or things like that, those truths might not be widely accepted as for everyone. And I think it's important to see that there is a bias in everything. And, you know, that changes what that truth means. And then to put it in an art museum context, especially when art, if you take away the historical value, there's sort of just a value of feeling and how it makes you feel. So if we're going to say museums are the authority, but then also say, however art makes you feel is the right answer, I think it's really interesting to look at what truth means then. It's two very different versions of truth and fact.
Yeah.
So I kind of entered it in a different way, and kind of flowed into a kind of meditation about truth. For me, it was easier to, you know, I kind of was like, okay, well, what is a museum? I mean, what is that? What is even that word? I come from an English background, you know, English literature is always in my head. So I went to, you know, the dictionary, and I like to find out the origins of words, like, what is this? And it was really interesting that it basically came from like either a combination of the Greco-Roman of seat of the goddesses, the muses. And of course, we've also heard of what the muses are. You know, muses are a spiritual, maybe a dead religion's idea of spirituality, but there is the spiritual in this. So if a museum is a building that it's supposed to be the seat of the muses that inspire creativity, that brought creativity to humankind, then we're kind of getting at there's a particular purpose of what the museum is, a certain truth that is being exhibited within the confines of the structure. And then I thought about the physical buildings themselves, which in a lot of ways take heavy cues from the architectural language of temples, of, you know, ascending the steps. That's an architectural language. The actual physicality of going up. I'm thinking of the MoMA. I grew up in New York, but not the MoMA. I'm thinking of the Met, Metropolitan Museum of Art, growing up. And the thing that I remember most are those long steps. So you have to walk up. You're ascending from a secular to a heightened sense of an experience that you expect when you walk into those doors. So for me, it was kind of rethinking some of those experiences of going into museums and understanding what truth am I seeing there. And that, you know, ties into what Dana was saying about a certain truth about what the objects are there, the human condition, the aesthetic. What is the truth that is being expressed in these museums? And it can be transformative. It can be almost a religious experience. So the question was hard for me because I couldn't separate the secular from the spiritual, because it seems that in the creation of a museum itself, the idea of a museum itself is kind of a combination of it anyway. So that's how I was kind of coming at the question and the idea of truth and aesthetic, and what a museum is supposed to convey, what truths are supposed to be conveyed there.
It's such an important point. I was chatting with some folks before we started this conversation, and in revisiting this card, in some ways, I feel like I set Carol Duncan up as sort of out of context in some ways, because we as audiences absolutely in some ways separate these spaces. But exactly what Amatula was saying, there's this sense that there's this ritual associated. This comes from the ritual of citizenship. So she's talking about the ways in which governments use this language of religion, of the spiritual, to codify in some ways national secular ideas of self. But I think that all of your comments, this nature of truth and like what we can see, what we can touch, and what we believe in, and those are not always the same things, right? And Dylan's point of who do we trust to give that information? I don't remember the year, but it was within the last decade. AAM, the American Alliance of Museums, put out a survey, and upwards of 85% of Americans trust museums as objective purveyors of facts, more than local news, more than the government, more than really any other source. And I think in some ways that speaks to the great privilege and responsibility of museums. But it also is in some ways pretty concerning, right? Because these are, of course, spaces that are constructed by, centuries of decisions of humans, of biases. And so, but it's a fascinating space that we occupy at that confluence of sort of this power of the spiritual and that ascension. And Dana's comment of those layers, I think too, the embedded of the object, the discipline of art history, the space of there are so many different competing factors. Allison, do you want to weigh in, or should we turn to our audience to see what they have to say?
Sure, maybe a little of both. I was going to say that when I read this question, I was thinking so much more about like the truth that could be conveyed through the object, like the truth of the artist's experience and the sort of has the biography come through. But it's so fascinating to hear you. Of course, I should have guessed that three museum professionals would first of all get out their reference books to ask what the question itself means, and to really pick apart how the museum has this authority in creating truth. So I'd love to hear how you all at home are thinking about this, whether it's how the museum conveys truth and how that differs from spiritual or political or religious spaces, or whether you're thinking about how the objects in a museum can help convey truth. So join us on our social media channels and weigh in about this Carol Duncan quote. And hopefully join us next Monday when we have a new musing to ponder. So let's thank you all, Amatula, Dana, and Dylan, for being here with us today.